Smell that? It's this good smell. It's new book day. Let's open our books, our Bibles to Exodus. We only get one of those every once in a while. I always get very weirdly thrilled when we get to a new book of the Bible. Not that I'm bored with the old one, but it's always exciting to see what God's Word has for us. So now we're going into the book of Exodus. I'd like to do a New Testament book and then an Old Testament. That will be the format, probably, more or less. We're going to Exodus chapter 1 on page 55 here in your pew Bibles. Please rise as we read this rather brief introduction to a rather epic story. Here's God's word to you. These are the names of the son of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his own family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all of that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. May God bless this reading of His Word today. Please have a seat. It's no surprise that with a baby in a basket and a burning bush and 10 plagues and a sea parting in two and Moses coming down off the mountain with the 10 commandments, the golden cow, the wars, construction of a giant traveling tent, that the book of Exodus has long been a favorite of Christians and Sunday school teachers and picture books all over. In fact, it even stirred secular Hollywood to the point where they have created no less than a dozen movies based on the book of Exodus. Some of them might even be your favorites. Charlton Heston or maybe Prince of Egypt, that's one of mine. Even today, a lot of the vernacular from the book of Exodus has entered in our popular culture. We don't even realize we use it when we say, oh, so-and-so came down off the mountain. We're really referring to Moses in Exodus. Or we say somebody parted the waters. But of course, we all know that Exodus is best known as the book of the Bible where modern medicine was first introduced. And this is the point where Moses got terribly sick. You remember that passage. He got deathly ill, and God said, here, take 2 tablets and call me in the morning. I'll show myself out. Thank you. I had a good run here as your pastor. It's all over, all downhill from here. My wife begged me, please don't put that joke in. I said, I had to. But seriously, when we look at the New Testament, if anybody asked you, what is the centerpiece of the New Testament? What is the centerpiece of redemptive history in the New Testament? I hope you would say the cross. It's pretty obvious. Right there in the New Testament, right at the center of everything is the cross. But if we ask that same question about the Old Testament, where is the center of redemptive history? Where is the one moment that shines bigger than any other moment? It's the Exodus. It has to be. It is a moment that not only impacted Israel back then, but it continued to have an impact throughout the rest of the Old Testament, all the way in through the New Testament. Again and again, when you read the Bible, you will be stumbling over mentions to Exodus. It became such a part of the Jewish legacy. And in the New Testament, we'd be reading about the Passover, right? That's the Last Supper. What we'll be celebrating today points back to Exodus. We read about the new Exodus. What is the new Exodus? We'll talk about that later and why that's so important. This event here that we'll be studying over the next 25 weeks not only involves rescuing Israel from slavery and from death, but taking them to a promise and seeing that promise fulfilled. Taking them on a journey toward a God that they had abandoned and they had rejected and they had failed again and again and again. And that God redeeming them and making them His own. It is a miraculous salvation, followed by the gift of the law and the fulfillment of a very important promise. In fact, 3 promises. And that's why whenever we go into the start of Exodus and the start of this tale of plagues and pyramids, of two countries that are clashing against each other, of basically two gods that are having a showdown in a foreign country, of heroes and villains and blessings and curses. When we look at all of this, we have to start by going back to the book that preceded it. We can't just start in Exodus verse 1 and go from there. It's always context is king. Context is key when we study the scriptures. And we have to start at the beginning of Exodus in the book of Genesis. Because Genesis flows in. This is a 5-book of the Pentateuch. And here we get the introduction that helps us understand what's happening in the book of Exodus. So to engage with this book, we go back to Genesis and we see the promise of a hero and what promises he would keep. This is very important. 3 promises that we look at, and I know you're eager to get into Exodus. You say, why can't we just go right into it? There's 3 things we have to understand. They're very vital, and we're going to look at these 3 promises today. So if we really had to pin down and trace back, where does the book of Exodus begin? Where's the story begin? It would have to be Genesis chapter 3. If you have your Bibles, feel free to open to Genesis 3. This is very important. Of course, we know that there in that chapter, the worst event that ever happened to the world happened right away when Adam and Eve disobeyed God. When God said, do not eat of the fruit of this particular tree. That is the one thing I'm requiring you not to do. And of course, they did it anyways. And that's when the fall happened. It's when humanity fell into sin. And at that moment, when this happened and they fell into sin, and God was pronouncing curses upon them, that they'd be cursed with childbirth and painful work and the sweat and toil, and at the end of all of it would be death. Not just death in this world, but death hereafter. In the midst of all of this, pronouncements in chapter 3, we see something really interesting. That in the middle of all of this, the worst day of Adam and Eve's life, God makes a surprising announcement to them. He says, you know what? You guys failed me. This was a horrible, horrible act you took, but I am going to fight for you. I'm not going to leave you to die in your sin. I'm not going to leave you to flounder in your own depravity. I'm going to fight for you. He makes a promise that he was going to send a hero. We like heroes. There's a lot of heroes, so probably we could go around in this room and each one of us share personal heroes or heroes from history, or if you're really shallow, a hero I like from comic books or from movies. Well, we have heroes. We like heroes. My kids and I just showed them Spider-Man 2 the other day, and I love their Aunt May has a great speech in Spider-Man 2 where she tells Peter Parker, her nephew, she doesn't know he's Spider-Man, but she says, people need heroes. They need people to look up to aspire to raise up. And she's like, whoever Spider-Man is, he's inspiring kids. And so Peter Parker kind of goes, whoa, there's a responsibility behind that. I think it's undoubtedly that one of the greatest heroes of World War II was General Douglas MacArthur. And this is a man who rose up to prominence in World War II, one of the greatest generals our country ever had. But at the beginning of World War II, he was assigned, he had a post in the Philippines. And he was in charge of 90,000 American and Filipino troops. And so that was his post. And he watched with dismay when Japan rose up and started sending his forces swarming all over the islands. And he was determined, Douglas MacArthur was determined, he was going to fight to the last with his soldiers. That he was going to stick it out, and they would have to kill him or capture him, but he wasn't going to leave. And President Roosevelt had to basically send him a direct order saying, we are evacuating you. We cannot afford to lose you. We can afford to lose all the rest of the soldiers, and that is a tragedy, but we cannot afford to lose you. We need you out of there so that you can help the war effort in the future. And so they, against his will, General MacArthur evacuated, a very long evacuation to Australia. But before he did that, he turned around and he addressed his troops probably one of the worst moments of his life. And he said, I shall return. I will come back. I will be your hero, and I will come back, and I will do whatever it takes, and I will liberate you. And it took Douglas MacArthur 2.5 years, during which he made plans, and he continually petitioned the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said, we've got to go back to the Philippines. We've got to go back. He made numerous radio addresses. He kept telling everybody who would listen to him, we've got to go back and rescue the people, rescue our troops, and rescue this country. He was a hero who intended to keep his promise. And after 2.5 years, it's exactly what he did. With an army at his back, he stepped back onto the shores of the Philippines. And he made a radio address at that time. He said, people of the Philippines, I've returned. Well, in Genesis 3:15, if you have your Bibles open, we have this interesting moment where, again, it's in the midst of all these curses, all these pronouncements, curses against Satan, curses against Eve, curses against Adam. And in the middle, we have this one verse that's the first verse we ever receive in the Bible that's about the gospel, about the good news. And in fact, when I was a kid, I probably read over this verse 1,000,000 times. Never really stuck out to me until somebody slowed me down and said, really examine what's being said here. I want to read this to you. Because at this moment where Satan is gloating, ha, I finally got these people to turn against their God, and they're going to be dragged down to hell with me. And he's celebrating this victory. God says to Satan, he makes his own radio announcement to the world. When he says this, verse 15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. You go, what's that about? He's not naming names here. But here is nothing short of a declaration of war. Satan has already declared war against God's people. God turns around and says, I declare war on you. I will put enmity, my forces of all that I can bring to bear against you. And I'm going to bring this enmity against you. And I'm going to do that through a great warrior. Now notice, the warrior's not named. He doesn't get even a title. We don't have a clue who this is, other than he does fight because he crushes. Said Satan would somehow bite his heel, that he would inflict a wound upon this warrior. But ultimately, this warrior would destroy the enemy. And so this is the first promise that we have to understand going into the book of Exodus, that God makes to Adam, saying, even in your depravity, even in your sin, I will redeem you, and I will do it through a hero. I am sending a hero to fight for you. But see, that we don't have to just look to the New Testament. We see throughout the Old Testament, God is actively fighting for his people. He is not just sitting back. The book of Genesis, if you want to think of it in terms of American history, the book of Genesis would be the Cold War. And the Cold War is this period of time where there's two sides that are in opposition of each other, and they're posturing, and there might be some skirmishes, but really it's not out-and-out war. Exodus is when the Cold War turns hot, when Satan really cranks up the dial, when he brings to bear everything he can against God's people, and in return, God brings it to the table, and he says, I'm going to fight for my people. And we see God stepping up and fighting. Adam was promised a hero, and this hero started fighting for his people long before he was incarnated as a baby in Bethlehem. In fact, in Jude 5, the New Testament author claimed this when he wrote, I want to remind you that Jesus, at one time, delivered his people from Egypt. Here's our hero. Finally gets a name, all the way almost to the book of Revelation. But Jesus was the one who delivers them. Well, even though the people didn't know at the time who the hero was, what he looked like, what his name was, the Son was hard at work, fulfilling a promise that he made to Adam. And as we go through Exodus, we're going to see that God keeps his word to fight for his people. So that's the first thing I want you to keep in mind as we go into Exodus. God promised to fight for his people. And he would do that. All right, well, there's a second promise made in Genesis that's pretty important to our understanding of Exodus, and that's one that God makes to Abraham in chapter 15. So if you want to flip ahead to 15, you can. But here in this chapter, God is making a covenant to Abraham, and we're studying that's part of the covenants we're going to be studying on Wednesday night. And he makes this covenant to Abraham. He says, I'm going to give you a threefold covenant. We like threes. I don't know why things come in threes. They tend to a lot. Pastors like to preach in threes. Bible tends to present things in threes. Things happen in threes. And here in Genesis 15, God gives Abraham a threefold promise. He says, 1, I'm going to bless you with a whole lot of kids. 2, I'm going to bless you with land so that those kids can go and settle and have a country of their own. And 3, I'm going to bless you with a national identity, that you will be a people. And so to do this, to illustrate this to Abraham, God takes Abraham outside, and we know the story. He says, look up into the sky, and your descendants will be more numerous than all the stars. It's a pretty good moment. Now, I got really curious about this, and I used my time wisely this past week to go on a tangent. I was curious how many stars we can see in the night sky. So I did a little bit. Thank Google for this. You know, Google has searches for pastors' burning time. And so I looked this up, and Google said, okay, well, if you're just outside, there's no light pollution. Like you're not in the city of Buffalo. You're out in the ocean maybe. There's no light pollution. You can see half the hemisphere at any given time. You can see, unaided with the naked eye, 4,500 stars. That's a lot, but that's not as many as I thought there would be by the naked eye. So that's how many you can see with the naked eye, and that's a lot. But if you grab just a pair of binoculars, your off-the-shelf binoculars, that number of stars that you can see suddenly rockets to 217,000. You see 217,000 stars in the night sky. Now, if you grabbed a 3-inch telescope, that number now goes up to 5.3 million. 5.3 million stars you can see with the telescope that my daughter has in her room. That's not that big. That's a lot of stars. Now, if you got a 15-inch telescope, I don't know if anybody has one of those, the number then goes up to 580 million. And it goes on and on from there. The Hubble telescope is enormous. I mean, the number of stars in the sky. And I don't really want to overthink this. I don't want to, sometimes we overanalyze things and we see past the intended meaning. But while I was thinking of this promise that God made to Abraham, the truth I got from this was that God's promises are often far greater than what we first assume. That we first think, well, I mean, Abraham probably stepped out there and went, wow, 4,500 kids, if he stood there and actually counted. That's a lot of kids. That's a lot of grandkids. I tell people I have 4 kids, and people go, wow, 4,500 kids, that's pretty impressive. I don't know what kind of minivan you have to have for that, but if he really knew the truth, if Abraham at that moment could see forward into history and see all of the descendants that he not only physically would have, but also would be ingrafted into his lineage through the church, through all the Gentiles that would come to believe in Jesus Christ, he would see the church. He would not just see thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people. He would see millions, if not billions, of his descendants. What amazing things that happen when we see God's promises fulfilled. In Genesis 15, it's an exciting promise, but it's one that takes a while to get started. Right through the book of Genesis, we don't see an enormous explosion of descendants. We see Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and then Jacob to his 12 sons. It's these 12 sons that we kind of get, these weird guys. And 12 is a pretty paltry start on outnumbering the stars in the sky. Yeah, in the first verses of Exodus that we read this morning, as you were reading this going, this isn't very exciting. I'm getting a list of names. But in these first verses, the author is making a point that out of starting with the 70 people of Jacob's household that went and settled in Egypt, out of those 70, suddenly there was an explosion of population. They had so many kids. They were exceedingly fruitful. And generation after generation, they multiply, and there's this exponential rise in the population of Israelites in the land of Egypt. And through this, we see God is keeping his promise. That he promised Abraham, I will create numerous descendants for you. I will forge them into a great nation, and I will bring them to a land that they will settle. And 2 out of 3 of these promises we will see fulfilled in the book of Exodus. It's awesome. God made a promise to them, and that promise was worth keeping. When Stephen, we remember in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, Stephen the martyr, the first martyr of the Christian church, he gets a great sermon in chapter 7, where he's recalling the entire history of Israel leading all the way up to Jesus Christ. And in that, Stephen mentions this specific moment when he says, as the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt greatly increased. He's not saying this is the moment where that will be completely fulfilled, but it was drawing near. And we see as it's drawing near, God is working to fulfill this promise. God was already on his way to making good at outnumbering the stars in the sky. Well, for his third and final promise, I want us to turn to Genesis 46. And Genesis 46 gives us our third promise that we need to remember as we go into the book of Exodus. So God has already promised to fight for his people. He's already promised to create numerous descendants and forge them into a nation. And now, in Genesis 46, verse 3, he makes one final promise to Jacob. It's a great promise. And starting in verse 3, God says, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down into Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. Out of all of the verses of Genesis, this is the one that the Israelites needed to hold on to, because this was the one verse that showed them that Egypt was part of the plan and the promise. That it was not some random aberration. It was not a road trip where the dad got really lost and refused to stop and ask for directions, and suddenly they end up in another country. Oh, well, we might as well settle here for the rest of our life. It's part of the plan. God says, I'm going to bring you there. I'm going to forge you into a great nation, and I'll bring you back. And all the while, I will be with you. And you need to remember this, because hard times are ahead. Dark times, terrible times, times that you will say, where is God? Will God ever deliver us? Does God even care? We need this foundation of these 3 promises, especially this last one, for the tough times to come. Because the Israelites will wonder if God cared about them anymore. We wonder that when we go through hard times in our life, when we go through the darkness, the valley of the shadow of death, and we go, God, where are you? Why would you let me do this? The Israelites couldn't see at the time that God was fulfilling his promise to forge them into a nation. They didn't see that God was still with them. But they had this promise, and God fulfilled it. God always fulfills his promise. And he knows that we'll forget. And that's why he wants us to write it down. It's why in the book of Exodus, God commanded Moses no fewer than 3 times and no more than 3 times. But 3 times he commanded Moses, write down everything that's happening. Why? Not because I want you to have an amazing scrapbook when you get to Israel. And you're like, ooh, here's a piece of manna I taped in here. No. I want you to write this down so that in the future, they'll know I keep my promises. So that when they're going through a hard time, they can look back to the book of Exodus and see God makes promises in Genesis that he fulfills in Exodus. And so when he makes promises to me, he'll fulfill them. And he makes so many promises to us. I mean, so many. If you ever want to spend an entire day doing nothing else, flip open your Bible and start making a list of all the promises God makes to you directly. And after a while, it will almost become comical how many promises God makes to you. And sometimes you'll look at that list, if you make that list, and go, there's no way. There's no way God will remember. There's no way God has the ability. There's no way God would actually do all this for me. Why would he do all this for me? I can't believe it. But God wants you to know, if you look at the past, you'll see a faithful God. And if you look at the future, you'll know he will be faithful to fulfill his promise. 2 Timothy 2:13, we'll end with this. It tells us this. Even if we ourselves are faithless, even if we ourselves are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. This is the most important thing that you'll ever need to understand about God's promises, is first and foremost, he makes his promise to himself. He says to himself, I will fight for them. He says to himself, I will create them a great nation. I will give them descendants. He says to himself, I will bring them into Egypt. I will bring them back out again. Because when he makes a promise to himself, he cannot deny himself. He has to fulfill that promise. The other day, dads, we say things off the top of our heads. But the other day, we were at bowling, and I sat with Casey, and he's doing his bowling, taking the bowling ball and going up the lane, just throws it, and walks away without looking. I kept telling him to turn around. And so I told Casey, I said, listen, if you get all of the pins down, a spare strike, I'll get you a juice. And he got really excited. That's motivation for a 6-year-old. Juice, right? So he actually got 2 spares. He got 2 spares. And so he's Dad, go get me a juice. I'm like, oh, okay. Now I didn't think it was going to happen. So now I'm bound by my promise. And I go and I realize that they don't have apple juice there at the bowling alley. And after complaining to the manager about that, I came back. I said, I'm sorry, I'll have to get you that juice later. And he got really upset with me. His face got really dark. He said, you make a promise in your heart, you keep it. Dang, Casey, okay. I'll go get you the apple juice. God makes a promise in his heart, he keeps it. That's all you have to remember for today. He made 3 incredible promises in the book of Genesis, and these will come into play again and again in the book of Exodus. We need to remember that God is walking with you every step of the way. I'm excited to study the book of Exodus. It is incredible. We're going to look at it with fresh eyes. We're going to go on this journey with the Israelites. We're going to see how God fulfills these promises to fight for them and to make them numerous, forge them into a country, and ultimately bring them out of Egypt. And we're going to see, I know you think you know this story. I think I know this story. But there's always more to it than that. And even if we know it, we can be reminded that we have a faithful God, that even when we're faithless, he is faithful because he will not deny himself. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we praise your name. We praise you because you are a faithful God. And you have made a promise that you would redeem your people, and you have. You have promised us that you would forgive our sins, and you have. That you'll walk with us in our life and never abandon us. That you will bless us, that you will hear our prayers, that you will love us, you will show compassion and mercy upon us. Lord, these are your promises. And so much more. Thank you that you are a God of promise. Thank you, you are a God of faithful promise. And Lord, that makes us excited to follow you, excited for the future. Because just as Israel was waiting to see how you were going to fulfill your promises, Lord, we're waiting. We're waiting to see that day that you promised us that you will come again, that you will set all wrong things right, that you will bring us to glory, that you will make us new. It will bring us to you so that we can see you with our own eyes. Lord, these are promises we're excited to see you keep. In your name. Amen. Wow. Now receive the benediction from the book of Ephesians. May Christ dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses all knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Go in peace. Go with his love today. God bless.